Today it's New Year's, Chinese New Year on January 26, 2020. We're in Chinatown in Washington, D.C. Could you tell us your name?
My name is Regina Chow McPhie. I was born and raised right here in Washington, D.C. And for only a few years, I lived in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But I came back home to Washington, D.C. and lived and worked in Washington, D.C. most of my life. I did live in Richmond, Virginia for at least 22 years. And at the time that I grew up in Washington, D.C., it was a southern city, so I have a southern accent. I don't know if it's obvious, but some people see it right away. I grew up not far from Chinatown, only a few miles on North Capitol Street. But my family was an integrated part of DC's Chinatown in the early days. My grandfather was an early resident of Washington, D.C., and he helped to start the Lee Family Association. His name was Charlie Lee. He left China. He was a scholar in China. He was a medical student. He was supposed to become a doctor. However, a lot of turmoil, political turmoil, poverty, war, strife occurred in southern China, and so he came to the United States to find a better life. He brought my father over when my father was a teenager, so my father grew up here in Washington, D.C. And in the early days, the Chinese were relegated to the laundry business and the restaurant business. And this is due to this ratio that occurred way back in the 1800s and the early days when the Chinese came to America after they finished on the railroads, and many went back to China. And the railroad, I am a descendant of the Chinese railroad workers on both sides of my family. As a matter of fact, I went to the 150th anniversary of the Chinese Descendants Railroad Association convention in Utah. And there was a big celebration at Promontory Point in Utah, okay? And it took 150 years for America to recognize the contribution of the Chinese railroad workers to the railroad, to the Transcontinental Railroad. Anyway, that's on my family on both sides. I'm a descendant. So my grandfather settled here in Washington, D.C. and brought my father over and his sons. And they ended up working, even though he was medically trained, he was an intellectual, he was relegated to the laundry business, as well as many other Chinese people who were relegated to, in the early days they call it domestic work, women domestic work, and that was due to race discrimination and the hatred of the Chinese. After they finished working on the railroads, many went back, but some stayed and tried to assimilate into America. They were hated, though. They were seen as taking jobs, or what possibly they were seen as threats. So what wasn't a threat was to do what they call women's work, and the Americans who were here, those mainly European ancestry, were not threatened by the Chinese men going into domestic work. That is cooking, cleaning, etc. So that's why there are so many Chinese whose origins are in the laundry business and the restaurant business. So here we are in Washington, D.C.'s Chinatown, and it is one of the Chinatowns in the United States that's diminishing. The area itself has grown a lot. That's through progress, gentrification. However, there's only a semblance of what is Chinese here in Chinatown. Albeit you have Chinese lettering and the DC government's effort to try and preserve Chinatown, many Chinese have moved out of the DC area, out of Chinatown. At one time I grew up in Washington DC I was born in the 50s, but we mainly used to visit Chinatown in the 1960s. and the 1970s. And I went away to school in the 70s, but I grew up here, and it was a thriving community. There were thousands here, and thousands who would visit, Chinese people who would visit all the time. It was our way of connecting with each other. So even for the Chinese who did not live in within the Chinatown neighborhood, those who came as far away as even Maryland would come to Chinatown on weekends to connect with their brethren, to connect with other Chinese, to have their children know other Chinese. My father felt it was important that we grow up knowing other Chinese and knowing our heritage. We had family here, so we would visit our relatives. And so every weekend we'd come and we would visit. We would buy our Chinese food, the groceries, medicines, and connect with family, say hello. And then my father was part of the Lee Association, so they had different activities. And back then it was very active, and there were a lot of activities for the association members to participate in. So, but the big event was the Lunar New Year parade, like what is happening today. That was very important. And the Chinese banquet. The Lunar New Year, or we in the Chinese would say the Chinese New Year, is probably the most important holiday of the year for Chinese people. That is Chinese from overseas as well as Chinese who are born here, Chinese Americans, naturalized Chinese, and people who are here as immigrants. But it is the most important holiday. I had the dilemma, which is the resolve, but I'm active on a church committee, and I was supposed to go to a very important meeting. But it was killing me that I couldn't come to Chinatown. So I appealed to them saying I needed an accommodation because this is a very important part of my culture and my heritage. And I would like to stick with my word to say that I will go to this meeting. But I also knew that I had suffering inner turmoil, that I am giving up my culture, my part of my identity to participate in this Western meeting when part of my legacy is here. And even though I'm not as involved, I still come, and I get involved because I go to the family association. I connect with people and I talk to people. And that's important. However, Chinatown is shrinking. It's part of progress. It's part of urbanization, and it is sad. At one time, D.C. was struggling. I remember in the 1960s and the early 70s, Washington, D.C. was a struggling city. We had big financial difficulties, and it was managed, but I won't say that we had really great management. Plus, I do believe there was some graft and some poor management of money. A good example, one of the pet peeves I have in Washington, D.C., and I don't live in Washington, D.C. now, but I did live here for many, many years. I paid taxes, I lived here. My mother lived in the Wildluck House for many, many years until she passed away. But I hate paying those traffic tickets, those parking tickets, the moving violations. And they seem to set it up now that you will get a ticket. If you drive in D.C., you're going to get a ticket because they have like one light after the other, and it's very confusing. It's easy to get a ticket. But they've collected millions, if not billions. Why is it their schools are not the best in the country? Why is it that I just talked to a woman who's part of something about neighborhood greens where they feed people in need, the working poor. And she said they do get some money. They get a lot of money from the D.C. government. But I said they should give more. I think that the D.C. government has come a long ways in terms of managing its neighborhoods and preserving what is Washington, D.C., what is uniquely Washington, D.C. in terms of the culture, the socioeconomic status, in terms of businesses and government, etc. So Washington, D.C. has changed tremendously in my lifetime. I was born in the 1950s. Here it is, 2020. And in this 60 plus years, I've seen it change tremendously. And I see it from the perspective of not just someone who was born and raised, but I had studied urban planning. And so I knew these changes were coming, And how do you deal with the dilemma of preserving this culture, the people, when the cost is so prohibitive now? The buildings are deteriorating. It costs a fortune just to pay for basics to fix it. That in a smaller town, like where I lived in Richmond, Virginia, it was much more reasonable to hire people, carpenters and building construction people. It's cheaper than here. It's still not cheap, but it was much cheaper than here. This place is so expensive, and the buildings are starting to deteriorate. How do people afford to live here? When you see a lot of the Chinese people who lived in an apartment building further up the street, some of them had to move because they couldn't afford to live here anymore. That's the problem. Many Chinese, there aren't many Chinese here now. I mean, at one time there were thousands. Now, it's only a handful, maybe 300. I think the last stats I saw was something like maybe 300, barely that, Chinese people live here. And they're struggling. And most of them, I think, are service workers who are catering to the industry. They're just eking out a living. They probably do rely on the help of the DC government. And the DC government has come a long ways in terms of helping the working poor, in terms of helping. I mean, I have to applaud them that there's a lot of effort to do the right thing and to do a lot. But I also wonder, with the millions, if not billions, that they collect for traffic violations. And I know a lot of it comes from tourists who don't want to pay those traffic fines, those parking tickets, the moving violation. They don't want to pay it because they live in other parts of the United States, if not the world. They're not going to pay it. I mean, they're not going to come here and appear in court, so they're going to pay it. And they get a lot of money. So I imagine, I do know, and I've read in the papers that a lot of the money goes to the school system, it goes to the housing, it goes to a lot. But with all that they make, I think it could be better. With the shrinking of Chinatown, why is it? Why are they getting pushed out? What can we do? What kind of help can we get? So yes, what we have is a dichotomy of the older generation, the baby boomers who want to preserve our heritage, who don't want to leave. And then there are the younger generation, the sandwich generation and the millennials. They don't have anything to do with this. They'll just come, and it's just cool to come to Chinatown, to go to the convention center, to eat Chinese. But in terms of keeping your Chinese identity, I do believe that's changed a lot. But I also believe that's changed a lot because of the intermarriage of Chinese and Asian people with other groups of people. So perhaps it's not so critical for the younger generation to maintain their Chinese heritage and identity. It is up to the sandwich generation, the Gen Xers, the baby boomers, to say it is critical, it's important. And so it's great we had, I know Samir with the Smithsonian Anacostia Museum, and they've done exhibits on Chinatown. And I have to applaud the director who passed away, but that she made it happen, and Samir made it happen. And Samir worked on it for a long time, because it is not easy penetrating the Chinese community to try and get the cooperation to even do some of the exhibits that he did. He worked with me, and my brother's Harry Chow, and he has a collection of Chinatown, a photographic collection, which has been used in many different venues. The Smithsonian is also in China at a museum in China, I think it's Shanghai, on DC's Chinatown. My cousin's wife, Penny Lee, is doing a film, a documentary on 3 Chinatowns, and DC is one of them. DC is a diminishing one. I think she's doing one in Chicago, DC, and I can't remember the other one. So they're on opposite end of the spectrum. One is thriving, one is barely hanging on, which is DC, and one is almost non-existent. And in my lifetime, I've seen, like in Philadelphia, and in some other cities. Like I saw the old Chinatown in San Francisco, which was changing, but San Francisco has a large Chinese community, and they've made a lot of effort to preserve it. There is New York's Chinatown that exists. So I guess the question at this point for perhaps many people would be, why do you want to preserve it? Why not assimilate and acculturate and just become one of, like everybody, an American? But of course, we all recognize culturally that it is important to preserve your heritage, to preserve your culture, to preserve your history, to preserve your language. Because if you don't and it disappears, what happens? You don't want to erase what existed. You don't want to have it die out. Because this is what the past is what makes us great in the present, but it also shapes our future. So, in terms of dealing with this dilemma, and I'm involved with the Lee Association, which is a major organization here in Chinatown. We have contributed so much to Chinatown, and it is a struggle to draw the young people to come and join. It is a struggle to continue to exist. We have an old building that we are doing our best to try and keep up. But we're like many other, organizations and institutions and businesses in DC's Chinatown where they're struggling to survive. There are many ways to do it. There's a Surratt House. You make that a national landmark, and then you get funding to preserve it. I don't know if you know the Surratt House, but that is the building where the plotting of Abraham Lincoln's assassination occurred. So it happened at the Surratt House, which is right here in the heart of Chinatown, and that has preserved that building. The DC government has helped to create, they worked with contractors to create the Wild Luck House. So it is preserving an existing heritage of the working poor, the people in need, and many Asians and Chinese who live here. My mother lived here, and it was great because they would make a lot of effort to preserve the heritage. They would show Chinese films to them. And a lot of, like there's a Chinese church would come, and the social service organizations, the Chinese social service organization would come and do a lot to help the people. So there's a lot going on to try and preserve it. And I do believe it is worth preserving, because if you don't have your heritage, you don't have your history, you don't exist. That's the way I see it. So, voila, here we are.
Thank you. That's perfect. I really appreciate you taking the time with us this afternoon, and we are very fortunate to be a part, playing some small role in that.
Thank you for doing this.